Signed languages. There are a bunch of signed languages. I've listed 3 of them here, but there are many. And maybe the first thing to say about them, I can remember a time when I believed as a child that signed languages were basically just coded versions of spoken languages. When I was a kid, you were sometimes taught ASL signs for things every so often in class, sort of the way you would be taught the occasional Spanish word in class, right, or whatever. It's like, here's a word in a foreign language, let's all learn this word. Unlike Spanish, the impression I was given by my teachers, who may actually have believed this, was that the way you spoke ASL was to speak English, but to use your hands. You know, so like every English word had an ASL translation, and there is something like that. It's called signed exact English, but it is not the standard language used by the deaf. The deaf use something called American Sign Language in America. Another sort of way to make this point may be that signed languages are not just coded versions of the spoken languages that are around them, is that to point out that American Sign Language is fairly closely related to French Sign Language, which I won't try to pronounce in French because I don't speak French. For historical reasons, the first schools for the deaf in America were established by people from France who had established schools for the deaf in France and began establishing them here. So American Sign Language is sort of a descendant of French Sign Language, and it is unrelated to British Sign Language and quite different from it. So, you know, go ahead and make all the jokes you want about American English and British English being different, but they're more similar to each other than either is to French. You know, American Sign Language is more similar to French Sign Language than it is to British Sign Language, because American Sign Language is not English; it's another language, one which is spoken with your body, especially your hands. Yes, I just said that. Thank you. Another way to make the same point. There are big grammatical differences between ASL and English, some of which we'll be exploring. Here's one. English has overt WH movement. Remember WH movement? Yeah. So in Who Did John See? Lots of other languages like Mandarin don't. And in this regard, ASL is more like Mandarin than it is like English. It's actually sort of a blend. You can do either one. But there's a very natural way to ask WH questions in ASL, which looks something like this. Here's a guy who is about to say, I think, who did John see? John saw who? Yeah, so I'll get him to sign that again, right? So John saw who, right? And who is signed like this. That's the ASL for who. There's another thing he's doing, which we'll talk about. Part of signing a question in ASL is not just what you do with your hands, but what you do with your face. You're required to look puzzled as you ask these particular kinds of questions. And so to tilt your head and furrow your brow. And there's some very careful work on where exactly you're required to tilt your head and furrow your brow. It turns out to be very interesting. It isn't just you do that for the whole question. You do that for certain parts of the question. And linguists who work on signed languages do work on what's going on. I'll put a link to this. This is a corpus of American Sign Language utterances by the folks over there at BU who have a center for studying ASL. There's a lot of really interesting data in here, which is tagged, as you can see. Anyway, I'll put a link to this on our website. So this is Carol Neidl. He's done a lot of really interesting work on ASL. Back into full screen mode. I'm sorry, I'm going to do a lot of this because we're going to be going back and forth between videos and my slides, and I am low tech. If I were higher tech, I would have figured out a way to incorporate the videos into the slides. But that's why this is the linguistics department and not some other department. Okay, so ASL is not English. It's not English because it's not all that closely related to British Sign Language, and it's also not English because, well, it has WH in situ, unlike English. Standard way to ask who did John see, the word order is John saw who. That's not to say that signed languages aren't in some kind of contact with spoken languages. So, typically, if you're a deaf person growing up in America, you have some kind of relationship with ASL. What kind of relationship depends on the circumstances. So it's not at all uncommon for deaf children to be the deaf children of hearing parents, and then their parents have to do some hustling and be careful to make sure that their children have a chance to learn ASL. Some children, hearing parents will try to learn ASL themselves and raise their children in ASL, but of course that's quite difficult, you know, to learn quickly a language like ASL. I say quickly because, you know, if you didn't know ASL before you realized that you had a deaf child, well, then you need to hurry up and learn it fairly fast. And that's a difficult position for parents to be in. So there are some varies with respect to how much resources these people have, whether they can do that in time for their kids to be exposed to ASL the way you need to be exposed to your first language. There are other deaf kids and then there are deaf kids who are lucky enough to be around native ASL signers from a very early age. The upshot of all this is that if you're deaf and you're growing up in the United States, you probably have some kind of relation to ASL. Maybe you become a fluent speaker. That's sort of the one hope. But you also have some kind of relationship with English. You're surrounded by people who are communicating with each other in English. And so there are what you could think of as borrowings between gestures of hearing people around you and the gestures that are used in the sign. Maybe one of the clearest examples of this, the pronoun for I in American Sign Language is this. So you point at your own chest. The pronoun for I in Japanese Sign Language is this. You point at your own nose. That's sort of borrowing from the standard way to point to yourself in these places. So in Japan, a lot of Asia, I think, the way to point to yourself is to point at your own nose. Whereas in America, the standard way to point to yourself is to point at your chest. So we could think of this as borrowing if we wanted to. There's some kind of contact between the spoken language and the signed language. Very early on, one of the first days, I think, we talked about Saussure and the idea of the arbitrariness of the sign, the observation that the fact that this is called a table is kind of an arbitrary fact. There's nothing about it that demands that it be called table. It could have been called chair, and the fact that it's called a table is an accident. The fact that we call it a table in English, but that in another language it could be called, you know, a mesa or a tuipud or any, you know, a bunch of other things. Languages get to arbitrarily decide what they're going to call things. Even in spoken languages, I think we said this before, there are, places where the way a word is pronounced has some kind of connection with what it refers to. The classic example of this is names for birds, which are often, not always, but often, imitations of the call of the bird. So, you know, chickadee is named after the thing that a chickadee says. It sounds like it's saying chickadee if you listen to a chickadee. Or, you know, in Passamaquoddy, the word for owl, or great horned owl, is coo calls, which is a pretty good imitation of an owl. You know? So there are some things like that where people seem to be imitating the sounds made by something. In ASL, of course, your sounds are not relevant. But in a sense, you have a lot of chances to have non-arbitrary signs. So there are signs that really do, you know, look like you're imitating the thing, you know, trying to make an image of the thing. So here's book, right? That's book. You can see why that's the word for book. Or this is tree, you know, and you can see why that's the word for tree. It's a picture of a tree, you know. This is the kind of thing that gets people to think that ASL is basically a very sophisticated version of charades, you know, that people are just sort of trying to imitate things and then you're done. But of course, that's not it. Signs are just as arbitrary in ASL as they are in any spoken language. That is to say, they're mostly arbitrary, with some other cases like chickadee for English or book for ASL, cases where it's possible to imitate something. There's a fair amount of work on the phonology of signed languages, which, when I say it that way, sounds like a bad joke. I mean, like, what does that mean, the phonology of signed languages? But it's actually, there's this really cool stuff that people have observed about, if you think of phonology as being the study of how the basic units can be combined to make slightly larger units. So, okay, for spoken languages, those units are sounds. And we make all kinds of observations about the rules for how those things get to combine. Cast your mind back to when I was showing you some Lardell data. I said, we convinced ourselves that it was useful to think that the accusative forms were a more reliable guide to the underlying forms than the nominative forms were. That's what we ended up with saying for Lardell, right? So we wanted to say, in is being added to the underlying form of the noun, which for woman is bingen, and for fish is yak. And if you ask a Lairdale speaker, what's your word for fish, they're not going to say yak, they're going to say yaga, but that's because although the Lairdale word for fish is underlyingly yak, Lairdale also has a basic rule, a bunch of rules, that lengthen monosyllabic words. And we talked about various rules of this kind. They add different things depending on what the monosyllabic word ends in, what sound it ends in, with the upshot that yak is not a possible Lairdale word because it's too short. Lairdale therefore lengthens it if you haven't added anything to it. So if you've made it accusative, you're fine, it's 2 syllables long, yagin, you're all done. But if you wanted it to be nominative, you weren't going to add any suffixes to it, well then you need to add another vowel because it's too short. That was the picture of Lairdale that we ended up with. Does that sound even faintly familiar? That's what we were talking about. That's a story about Lairdale that says Lairdale is like many languages in having what's called a minimal word requirement. That is, in Lairdale it says Lairdale words can't be just 1 syllable long. If you have a word that's going to end up being 1 syllable long, you do something to it to make it longer. ASL has also been argued to have a minimal word requirement. And the argument goes like this. There are signs that, if they're by themselves, they involve a movement which is often short. But then that movement goes away if they're made part of a larger word. So here's the ASL for think. Take your finger, you move it towards your temple and touch yourself in the temple briefly. Yeah, that's think in ASL, I think. And here's shocked. So shocked starts with your finger at your temple, where it would be for think, and then it has a second component. So it's shocked. Right? I'm shocked. Yeah. So think, one way to think about think is just having your hand in a position, that's too small. That's like a monosyllable in Lairdale. And so you add something, you add a motion. Your hand moves towards your temple. But if you're making shocked, which is think plus something else, it's kind of like the accusative of fish, then it's okay to just start with your hand at your temple and then do the second half. You don't have to add that motion to your hand. Yeah. And suggestion that's been made in the literature on ASL phonology is this is like a minimal word requirement. So Diane Brentari has suggested ASL signs have a minimal word requirement. She doesn't say it, like Lairdale. I forget what minimal word language she's talking about. So they have to contain at least one move, is her idea. Think is the ASL version of the Lairdale word for fish. Yeah. Remember Polish obstruents? I kind of like this class because I think I promised you that I was never ever again going to talk about Polish, and so I apologize. It's the last day. You don't have to hear any more about Polish. Sorry, go ahead.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
Are there other words that have think something?
Oh dear. Now we get beyond my very modest knowledge about ASL. I don't know. Are you thinking that might be the only one?
Well, I think again, if you, I guess, look at compound words, there's definitely the ability to like pair them with other things.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if that's like a common way to just show surprise, maybe like confusion.
Oh, you mean having this as part of a larger sign? Yeah. So Brentari's discussion certainly makes it sound like there are a bunch of these. Shocked is the example she uses, and I'm afraid I don't know any other examples off the top of my head. I'll try to find the paper that I got this from, and I can put it on the website so you can take a look. Yeah. So here I am signing think at you. Yeah. Polish. Last time I promise we will talk about Polish. Polish obstruents. Yeah. So stops and fricatives. We convinced ourselves that Polish has what's called final devoicing, cross-linguistically extraordinarily common phenomenon, in which if you have a voiced obstruent at the end of a word, it becomes voiceless. So if you look at the plurals of these nouns, then you can see that before the plural suffix e, you can have both voiced and voiceless stops and fricatives in the last example, nose and rubble, the plural of rubble, which hopefully none of us will need anytime soon. But that if you don't have the plural, all of these obstruents are voiceless if they're at the end of a word, because Polish has final devoicing. Right? This was part of the argument that we need to posit an underlying representation for a word like lie, let's say, the second line there, which ends in a voiced stop, because that gives us the best, the best match on the data. So it allows us to account for the fact that the plural of bow and lie look different from each other. They're wookie and woogie. Even though the singulars look the same. Yeah. This is what we were doing back when we were doing Polish. Yeah? Have I triggered your Polish flashbacks? Okay. So it has voiced obstruents, but they're limited in where they can go. They can't go at the ends of words. Here's an observation about the distribution of finger wiggling in ASL signs. So sometimes when you make an ASL sign, you wiggle your fingers. There are ASL signs in which there isn't much movement or just one of Brentari's short movements, like the word for color, which is this. So you put your hand to your chin and you wiggle your fingers. Yeah. There are also signs where your hands are moving and the wiggling is happening during the move, like go up in flames. Where your hands are rising and your fingers are wiggling. That's how you do go up in flames. So ASL signs can have finger wiggling in them, but there are imaginable signs that you don't get. So you could imagine a sign where your fingers would wiggle and then you would move. It would be like go up in flames, except you would wiggle first before you began moving. Or in which you moved and then having reached your destination, did a long move, not one of Brentari's short moves, but a long move, did your move and then wiggled your fingers. There aren't any signs like that. So finger wiggling is either confined to the position at the end of one of Brentari's short movements, or if your hands are moving over a longer distance, like in Go Up in Flames, well, you have to wiggle the whole time. Similar observation about hand shape change. So there are signs where your hands just do a short move and then change their hand shape, like understand, where your hand moves into position and then put up one finger, understand. Or old, where your hand starts at your chin and moves as it moves away from your chin, old. Yeah?
We're talking about other sort of like mental concepts being expressed in sign language, and understand. Seems like it also starts at the temple.
Yeah, so I think, right, I think there are a number of, not surprising maybe, a number of mental, so forget is another one, this is forget, where you sort of wipe something off of your brain, yeah. Using your middle finger is also used for being sick. So yeah, there are a bunch of signs that use your head that have to do with what's going on in your head. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, so ASL has finger wiggling, but there are limits on where finger wiggling can go. It goes during the motion, or it goes right after one of Brentari's short movements. Hand shape change is the same. It goes after one of Brentari's short movements, like in understand, or it goes during the movement, like in old. Yeah. But there aren't, did I say this in the next slide? Yeah, again, you could imagine a sign where, which would be like old, where you would start with one hand shape, you'd change shapes and then move, right? Or where you would move a long distance and then change shapes, but there aren't any signs like that. And so people have suggested, just like a phonologist has to be able to say things like, this is a language that has voiced obstruents, but not at the ends of words. There are limits on where they can go. ASL has finger wiggling and it has hand shape change, but it has rules about where they can go in the sign. And then of course you want to know why, what constrains these to where they go. But when I say that there's work on ASL phonology, this is what I mean, is people trying to figure out what makes something a possible well-formed ASL sign. Turns out there are limits on this. One observation actually is that people have made as they do this work, there are compounds or polymorphemic signs, which you can tell are polymorphemic because they appear to violate these rules. So I just said there aren't any signs where you first finger wiggle and then move. Here's an apparent counterexample to that. There's a word hypnotist, which goes like this. But that's a two-morpheme sign. So it's hypnotize, which is a Brentari's short movement plus finger wiggling. And then there's a suffix, which is the agentive suffix. You use it to make, you attach it to nouns to make people who do that noun. So that's a hypnotist. Hypnotist by itself looks like you're finger wiggling and then moving. But that's because there's a morpheme boundary between those two things. So within a morpheme, you can think of it as a bisyllabic word if you want. Yeah. So in the first syllable, you're doing finger wiggling the same way you're doing finger wiggling in color. Yeah. And then there's a second move, which involves moving your hands. ASL has one-handed signs, like understand. And it also has two-handed signs, like go up in flames. There's an interesting restriction in two-handed signs on the second hand. So the second hand either has to stay still, like in tree, where one hand moves and the other hand just stays there and is sort of the background for the first sign. Or it does the same thing as the other hand. Teach, both your hands are doing the same thing. I love this sign for teach. You know, I want to do this when I teach now. Or bicycle, where your hands are doing the same thing, but they're out of phase with each other. Yeah, so they're both going in circles. Which is kind of interesting because, and that's it, right? So there aren't ASL signs in which one hand is doing one thing and the other hand is doing a completely different thing. Right? And it's not because, does that make sense? Right? So your hands can't both be moving and doing different things. Which is interesting because it is actually physically possible to violate this, to have your two hands both moving and doing different things in poetry. So there's a video, which I'll try to show you now, of an ASL poet, a guy named Clayton Valley, who wrote many poems in ASL. There are a lot of YouTube videos of him performing his poems. And this one is called Snowflake. What he does in it, the reason I'm going to show you the video is that I can't physically do it very well. I'll show you what he does, but I'll tell you what he's about to do just so you can see it. With one hand, he's doing the sign for snowflake, which is a snowflake falling. And then with the other hand, he's signing one-handed versions of, I may not get the order right, white, cold, beautiful. So he's doing this as this hand is moving. So this hand is moving, and with the other hand he's going, you know, white, cold, beautiful. And as you can see, I can't physically do this, but he can. Let me show you him doing it. If I can get it. Where is he? Yeah. So here's Clayton Valley. I think I paused it in more or less the right place. We may have to watch this for a little bit. So he's about to sign about looking out the window at a snowy day. The snow is coming down. And now I think it's about to come. Here's the snow piled up. Come on, Clayton. Yeah, here it is. There's the snowflake falling. White, beautiful, cold. Yeah, with his other hand. So it's physically possible to do that. Yeah, but at least if you're Clayton Valley, you know, if you're a fluent ASL signer. But there aren't any ASL signs that do it. It's one of those rules that you break in order to perform poetry. So I'll put a link to that. I'll put a link to that poem on the website so you can see. Yeah.
I feel like that might just be because most people aren't capable of doing that. Like, you know, like do a circle with one hand and a square with the other. Like most people can't do that.
So I think it's one of those things that probably requires practice, right? and question, is this something that any ASL signer could just do cold, you know, without any trouble? If, you know, they saw the Clayton Valley video, they'd be like, oh yeah, and then they would do it, right? Or whether, and I can't do it because I'm not a fluent ASL signer, or whether it's because Clayton Valley practiced in his room hour after hour and eventually got to where he could get his hands to do that. Yeah. Right. So I think you're right. It's not exactly that it's surprising that ASL isn't full of signs that are like this with your two hands doing two different things. But it's interesting that it is physically possible to learn to do it. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's a conscious design rule. It is one of the first things we learn in the ASL class, and I believe that is for you to focus your attention on the dominant hand.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So, I mean, that you're absolutely right. That what happens is that the non-dominant hand either copies the dominant hand or just sits still and lets, you know, like in tree. So you think this is something somebody deliberately did, like they decided that ASL should work this way. It'd be interesting to see. I have no idea. I'm doing all this talk about ASL. I started by saying there are many sign languages. I don't know whether this is true in every sign language. I haven't heard of a sign language in which your hands are allowed to move independently of each other. So it'd be interesting to see how universal this is. Yeah.
Is there a left-handed versus right-handed version of
No.
ASL?
I mean, if you, so I'm right-handed, and so this is my version of tree. If I were left-handed, this would be my version of tree, and they mean the same thing, as far as I can tell. Similarly, for the signs that use both hands, I mean, this is a consequence of these facts about the signs that we've been talking about. For the signs that use both hands, like teach, if I'm somebody described this to me as the equivalent of talking with your mouth full. If I'm busy with my right hand, you know, I'm holding something or whatever, then I can sign teach just with my other hand, right? And you don't lose anything in a sense, right? You might if there's also a sign that's just like this, right? Valley actually in this video is doing something like that. The sign for cold uses both hands. They're both moving. But because his right hand is busy doing snowflake, he does a one-handed version of cold. Yeah. 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 Okay, and I alluded to this a second ago. There's a lot of work on the use of parts of the body other than your hands, so your non-manual component. There are facial expressions that are involved in doing certain kinds of things. So as I said, in WH questions in ASL, WH questions require you to furrow your brow and look puzzled. And there's all this interesting work on where exactly you're required to do that. As I said, ASL is a WH in situ language. And so, or it has the option of WH in situ, and I do have chalk today, which is nice. So apparently what that means is that if you're doing the ASL for, you know, you gave what to the teacher, where, just pretend that all of this is ASL, you're required to look puzzled here. That is, from the beginning of the question until you get to the WH word. And then you're allowed to relax your face. Yeah. And if this is an embedded question, like, you know, I don't know. So if I'm saying the ASL for I don't know what you gave to the teacher, right? Well, then this is still true. You sign I don't know without doing a WH facial expression, but you do one for this part. You know, so from the beginning of the question to the WH word, you're required to look puzzled, which is kind of cool. You know, there's this work on this. Or similarly, there's a negation facial expression in ASL. So negation, ASL has a word for not. It's this. So like if I want to sign, oh, sorry.
So does that mean that like the facial expressions we make when like expressing ourselves verbally are like related to, or almost like based in interaction with others? Or like, because I would think it's something that's like innate.
Yeah.
Art, like when you're confused, like you make an expression with your face. But,
Yeah.
like, is it just related to like the fact that you're talking to someone you want them to understand you're confused, or like how does that work?
These are all really interesting questions to which I don't know the answers. One possibility, right, is that the puzzled facial expression, the WH facial expression in ASL, it's a little bit like the two pronouns for I that I was talking about earlier, you know, that this is I in ASL and this is I in Japanese Sign Language, and that maybe that's connected to gestures that hearing people make, that speakers of sign languages are using in a different way. So, you know, you're right, I might, if I were asking you a WH question, look puzzled. I don't have to look puzzled to ask you a WH question. And there are no particular restrictions on when I should look puzzled, you know, like where during my question I should look puzzled. But in ASL there are, like you actually have to do this, and you have to do it at the right points, you know, in the right points of the WH question. So their use of facial expressions is a little more sophisticated, I guess, or rule governed than they have been shown to be anyway for speaking people. Now, maybe all this shows us that there hasn't been enough work on facial expressions for spoken languages. We're all obsessed with the sounds, right? But for ASL, there's all this clever work on what you do with the rest of your body. Yeah, good question. Similarly, there's a negation facial expression. So if I want to say I'm not deaf, I can just sign I, not, and deaf. Or I can point at myself and go and shake my head as I sign deaf. Right? So I don't have to use the sign for not at all. By shaking my head, I convey negation without using the negation sign. So there are facial expressions for both of these things. I don't know what happens when they combine, because presumably you can ask negative questions. I guess you can do all of these things with your head at once. One of the other properties of signed languages, which is cool and there's a lot of work on, is the use of loci in space to refer. So an English sentence like Trump told Biden that he would win is ambiguous, right? So he could refer to Trump or to Biden or to anybody else in principle, right? It has to refer to some male person, could refer to either of these people. If you were going to sign this in ASL, and I'm not going to, I don't know enough ASL, but I can tell you the basic ideas about how this would work. First of all, you would need what are called name signs. So you would need to sign the names Trump and Biden. The simple way to do that is by finger spelling. So there are correspondence to all of the letters. You can sign all of the letters of the English alphabet. So you could sign TRUMP, only you'd do it faster if you knew ASL. But there are also what are called name signs, which are signs that are just signs for particular people, typically famous people. Or people who are deaf, I think, generally end up with name signs. Name signs are often they often contain the first letter of the person's name. I had a classmate in grad school who was deaf. He's now a professor at Gallaudet University. His name was Gaurav in English, and his ASL sign involved the letter G, which is the first letter of his name, put on in the chest. Whoa, sorry. So that's Gaurav in ASL. The name sign for Noam Chomsky, which is one of the few other signs I know, is this. So it's a C. When I first saw it, I was like, what, they think he's an alcoholic? What is the deal? It turns out to be C based on the sign for God. So it's God with a C. Is Noam Chomsky. It was invented by someone with the proper level of respect for Noam Chomsky. The name sign for Trump, there are apparently various name signs for Trump. One of them is this. Or this. That's another one. For Biden, I was looking, and apparently there isn't general agreement on what the name sign for Biden ought to be. One of them is this, which is apparently supposed to be a gesture that indicates that he likes to wear sunglasses, I guess. It's connected to the fact that he has sunglasses a lot. By now, there must be a name sign for Biden, because of course he's surrounded by interpreters when he's talking, you hope. But anyway, if you wanted to say, bless you, in ASL, Trump told Biden that he would win, you'd sign Trump and you'd sign Biden, and you would put them in places, right? So you'd say Trump, and you'd put Trump here, right? And Biden, put Biden here. And then you would say, he told him that he, and then you would either point at Trump or you would point at Biden, would win. Right? So the ASL versions of this sentence are not ambiguous. Right? So you either, you make it clear, you've either pointed at Trump or you've pointed at Biden. Right? So he always refers to someone in particular. Or, if what I want to convey to you is that Trump told Biden that Obama would win, well, then I need to sign Obama and put Obama somewhere else. You can have many, many people in front of you in space. Right? I believe people who have studied this have not found limits on how much subdividing of space you can do in front of you. I don't know how hard they've tried, but yeah, it's certainly not just two. Yeah, you can have lots of pronouns in front of you. There are even fancier things you can do. I was just reading a paper about this. This is kind of astonishing. So if I want to say something in ASL like, most of my students came to class, what I do is I start by signing my students. And then I put my students in a circle, right? So I have my students, and then I establish a circle that all of my students are in. And then I'm going to make the sign for most, which I think is something like this. And then I describe a smaller circle that's part of the circle that I've just described for you, right? And then I would sign, went to class, right? So, I make my circle that has all the students, and then I have a subset of that. I draw the kinds of Venn diagram-y things we were talking about before. Here are the students. And the cool thing about this is now what I've got in front of me is a space that's got my students, and it's subdivided into a larger space that's got most of my students, the one who came to class, and a smaller space that's got the students who didn't come to class. So the next sentence, apparently, can be, they stayed home, pointing at, the ones who didn't come to class. Right? In English, if I say, most of my students came to class, they stayed home, I'm contradicting myself, right? Because, and there's something kind of interesting going on here. When we were talking about pronouns, we sort of breezed by them, right? Pronouns, well, they refer to people who are salient or whatever, right? Certainly if I pass a bunch of students on the infinite corridor, I could remark to you, they're on their way to class, right? And we don't have to have been talking about them before. They're just, they're in the world. I get to assume that you're thinking about them. But if I say, most of my students came to class, well, I'm telling you that they're my students and that most of them came to class, and then there were the ones who didn't, right? That's what that means, right? But I still don't get to refer to the ones who didn't come to class with they, right? They has to refer to the ones who did come to class. But in ASL, I get to point at them, right? And so I get to refer to them right away. Joseph?
So most of my students came to class.
Yeah.
That's like, because the conservativity of the quantifier most, like, you're describing the sum set, but doesn't the conservativity mean you get to ignore the part?
If we didn't know about ASL, I might have said, why don't I get to refer to that other set, right? And you might have said, it's because of the conservativity of most. Yeah, that would have been a pretty plausible thing to say. And it's maybe even right. But the fact that in ASL you can refer to them, where the pronoun suggests that maybe it's actually something else going on. There's all kinds of stuff like this in spoken language, by the way. It's not just about quantifiers. And so like old observation, if I say, John has a child, she's 5, that's fine, and she, you probably figure it's the child I'm talking about. If I say, John is a parent, she's 5, that's a weird thing for me to say. Even though by saying John is a parent, I'm telling you that John has a child, right? That's what that means, right? But it doesn't help. So we're like limited in how we can use pronouns. I'm sorry, you had a point you wanted to make a while ago.
Can we make finer distinctions, like for the next sentence, you can say, I get most of my students who don't come to class.
I believe you can then, draw subparts of these. I'll put that paper on the website too. You can, there's all kinds of stuff that you can do with space. Again, I don't know what the limits of it are, but it would be really interesting to find out. Yeah, they can do more referring to sets and subsets than we can do because they have the advantage that they've got like a blackboard, right? They get to point at, where everything is, right?
Okay, so this seems like pretty different from like spoken English, and
Yeah.
I imagine that it like shapes deaf individuals' like perception of the world and just their perspective in general. But is their written form of communication like very different from a non-deaf individual, or like are they similar?
Oh, okay. So there have been various attempts to come up with writing systems that are sort of indigenous to ASL, and I don't think any of them have gained a lot of popularity. So when linguists are writing like papers about ASL, what they typically do is, I did a parody of it over here, that if you want to write, an example sentence that's like, I saw a tree, for tree, you're going to write, for this sign, you're going to write the English word tree in all capital letters. So you use all capital letters to indicate that you're talking about signs. And then they'll annotate these if you're interested in indicating things about like facial position and facial expression and things like that. There are ways of annotating that to show, you're doing the WH facial expression or whatever. As far as, actual ASL speakers go, my understanding is that they typically don't write in ASL, right? So dictionaries, you can find dictionaries of ASL online. They have lots of videos. Or they'll have pictures of, one frame after another. So there isn't, literacy among the deaf is apparently a really serious problem, as you might imagine, right? So if somebody who's profoundly deaf, who like hasn't heard sound, learning to spell if you can hear is hard enough. Learning to spell if all of the symbols that you're being asked to write just don't represent anything for you at all. It's got to be a nightmare. And so, although ASL native signers typically write in English, it's apparently very hard, as you might imagine. Yeah. Yeah. Points about this? Okay. Okay. And so yeah, this has all been about space and other things to do with your body. I wanted to show you one other video. So there's another phenomenon that people use when they're telling stories or talking about multiple people, which is what's called role shift. It's what people who work on it call it, where you'll shift your body. People do this in spoken language too, but again, in ASL, it's apparently more or less obligatory. You'll shift your body to represent the different characters that you're talking about, right? So, and I'll show you a story where somebody does this. It is a story about throwing a stick for a dog, and one of the nice things about it is that there's no need at all to explain what the guy is talking about. Maybe at the beginning a little bit. He's going for a walk with his dog. Oh, stop that. Okay, so there's his dog, right? And there's him. Yeah, so he's doing roll shift. He's going to get a stick. Yeah, and there's the dog again. The dog's all excited. There's the guy. Throws the stick. Gonk. And here comes the dog, right? And so so I'm showing this to you partly because it's a cute story. Thank you, he says. I'm showing that to you partly because it's a cute story, but also because it's a good example of roll shift. So he's, oh, there's Clayton Valley again. Good example of roll shift. So he's, using his body to go back and forth between being the dog and being the person. And apparently this is a standard thing that you do if you do ASL, if you're a native speaker of ASL. It's part of being a fluent signer as opposed to being someone who knows a bit of ASL. Full screen mode, that's what I want. Okay. So this was what I wanted to try to show you about ASL. So just to review, ASL, American Sign Language, it's a language. It's a language spoken here in America by many deaf people. It is not English. It's not any form of English. It's not charades, and it's not English with all of the words replaced by signs, which is what I believed when I was a kid. It's a language that's quite different from English in various ways, as I've tried to show you. There's a lot of interesting work on ASL. A lot of it is on ASL phonology, where by phonology we mean what we always meant by phonology, I guess, which is the rules for how the articulators work. So phonology, up until now, has all been about what you're doing with your vocal tract and what the rules are for what your vocal tract is allowed to do here or there in a word. There's an ASL version of this where people try to understand, what are the various articulators, your fingers, your hands, your wrists, the rest of your body. What are those parts of you allowed to do at different points in a sign? Yeah. And then, as I said, there's a lot of interest in the use of parts of your body other than your hands. Lots of work on facial expression and on roll shift, shifting your body back and forth. And that's what I wanted to tell you about ASL. Any questions about any of that? Then we are done. You officially know everything about 24900. So 24900, you know everything about linguistics. No, actually that's false. One of the main goals of this class has had several goals, but one of the main goals of this class has been to convince you that there are some interesting mysteries having to do with how language works. And that if you take more linguistics classes, you might get to learn more about how those mysteries work. If you take even more linguistics classes, then you could be the person who solves these mysteries for the rest of us, which would be great. One of the nice things about linguistics, I think I've said this before, it's a field that's been around for a while. We have some results, but it's not all that hard, even in an intro class, to bring you right up to the edge of what we understand and invite you to look down into the abyss. And ask yourself how you could build a bridge. This metaphor is getting away from me. How you could move further, how you could get further than where we are. So I hope that at least some of you will be inspired to want to do that, because we need people to go out there and solve the mysteries that haven't been solved. Questions about any of that? All right, then we are done. Go forth. Do your class evaluations. So we're ending early, so you'll have a good half hour to think hard about what you want to write in your class evaluations. And thanks very much. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Go out and enjoy the day.